My name is Megan Hall. I am 30 years old. Last Tuesday, I sat in a freezing law office in Burlington, Vermont, and watched my aunt smirk as the executor read my grandmother's last will and testament. Every cousin got something: cash, land, jewelry. My aunt got the sprawling 40-acre estate. My cousin Chloe got the offshore accounts. My older brother Ethan got the domestic stock portfolio. I was the only one who spent the last 5 years actually visiting my grandmother, and my name was not mentioned a single time. My aunt leaned across the mahogany table, looked at my frayed sweater, and told me I was finally getting what I deserved. But she didn't know the executor had a second envelope sitting in his briefcase. And what was inside that envelope cost my family every single dime they thought they had just won. Before I tell you what the executor pulled out, welcome to Cherry Vengeance. Hit subscribe if you believe loyalty should be rewarded, and drop a comment telling me your age and what state you are listening from. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to that mahogany table, to the exact moment my aunt thought she had erased me from the family. The wall clock in Julian Pierce's law office ticked with the rhythm of a slow drip. It was the only sound permitted in the room. Outside, a late November snow squall battered the windows, blurring the view of Lake Champlain into a wash of slate gray. Inside, the air tasted of stale espresso and dry leather. Julian sat at the head of the conference table. He turned a heavy parchment page in his dark folio. "To my daughter Cynthia," Julian read. His voice was a flat baritone, empty of sentiment. "I leave the primary estate located in Stowe, including the main house, the surrounding 40 acres, and all structural improvements." Cynthia exhaled a breath she had been holding since we walked through the door. Her manicured fingernails, which had been drumming a frantic, metallic beat against the polished oak table, finally stilled. She leaned back, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her cream turtleneck. As an appraiser of antique textiles, I noticed the fabric's stiff, unnatural drape. It was a synthetic blend masquerading as luxury. That was Cynthia in a nutshell. "To my granddaughter Chloe," Julian continued, "I leave the contents of the offshore liquid accounts." Chloe did not look up from her phone. She simply adjusted the tilt of her screen, checking her lighting in the reflection of the dark glass. "To my grandson Ethan," Julian said. I watched my older brother shift in his chair. He refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at the brass paperweight on Julian's desk. "I leave the entirety of the domestic stock portfolio and the remaining commercial real estate shares," Julian finished. Ethan swallowed hard. He gave a single, tight nod. Julian closed the leather folio. The satisfying thud of the cover echoed in the quiet room. He folded his hands. That was it. My name had not been spoken. I sat perfectly still, listening to the clock. I did not feel the sting of rejection. I felt a cold, stabilizing clarity. Beatrice Hall, my grandmother, had raised me. I knew her better than anyone in this room. She did not make oversights. She made calculations. Cynthia broke the silence. She offered a sigh of manufactured pity, turning her gaze down the table to me. "Well," she said, her voice coated in artificial sweetness, "I know this must be difficult, Megan, but Mother always was a pragmatist. You chose a quaint little hobby over a real career. She knew you would not know what to do with capital. It is for the best." Ethan flinched but kept his mouth shut. Chloe finally locked her phone screen, offering a thin, rehearsed smile. "We will send you something from the house," Cynthia added. She stood up to signal her victory and the end of the meeting. A vase, perhaps, or one of her old quilts for your appraisals. She reached for her coat, draped over the back of the chair. "Sit down, Cynthia." Julian had not raised his voice. The command was spoken at a conversational volume, yet it stripped the oxygen from the room. Cynthia froze, her hand hovering inches from her collar. Julian reached into his briefcase. He withdrew a thick, weather-beaten manila envelope. The red wax seal on the flap bore Beatrice's personal crest. "The execution of the primary will is concluded," Julian said, looking directly at me for the first time since we arrived. "However, I was instructed to wait until the primary distributions were formally accepted by the room." He broke the wax seal. The sharp snap of the resin echoed louder than the clock. "There is a second document." Julian held the envelope aloft. The silence in the room shifted from triumphant to fragile. Cynthia lowered her arm. Her synthetic cashmere sweater suddenly looked less like a victory lap and more like a cheap costume. Julian slid a silver letter opener through the thick manila paper. The sound was a sharp tear that made my brother Ethan flinch. From the envelope, Julian extracted 2 items. He placed them on the mahogany table with deliberate care. The first was a heavy, tarnished brass key. The metal bore the dark patina of age, the grooves worn smooth by decades of use. The second was a thick, weather-beaten leather ledger bound by a small brass padlock. Julian did not offer a congratulatory smile. He looked at the room with the clinical detachment of a surgeon delivering a diagnosis. "This is not an addendum to the primary estate distribution," Julian stated, tapping his pen against the ledger. "This is a separate, legally binding contractual condition. Beatrice established a blind trust independent of the probate court. Access to the trust and its contents are tied directly to this key." Cynthia let out a sharp, breathless laugh. A blind trust. Mother despised trusts. What is in it? Julian ignored her. He turned his attention solely to me. "Megan, your grandmother outlined a specific residency clause. To inherit whatever is secured by this key, you must inhabit the saltbox weaver's cottage on the eastern edge of the Stowe property. You must reside there alone for exactly 30 consecutive days. You are forbidden from accepting any external financial assistance. If you vacate the premises for a single night, the contract is voided and the trust dissolves." Cynthia laughed again, louder this time. Chloe looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing in confusion. Ethan kept his gaze locked on the table, a muscle feathering along his jawline. "The weaver's cottage," Cynthia sneered, her confidence rushing back into her posture. "She means that miserable, uninsulated shack in the woods, the one with the drafty floorboards and the ancient stone hearth. Megan, Mother is not giving you an inheritance. She is giving you a chore. She is punishing you for wasting your life playing with dusty fabrics." Chloe smirked, sliding her phone back into her designer handbag. 30 days without central heating. Have fun freezing to death, cousin." I did not respond to their taunts. I kept my gaze fixed on the table. I reached out and rested my fingertips against the ledger. The leather was stiff and brittle, scored with deep lines. As I ran my thumb over the binding, a faint scent rose from the worn pages. Peppermint oil and old paper. It was Beatrice. It was the exact smell of her private study, the room she only let me enter when she was teaching me how to authenticate historical documents. My heart gave a steady, rhythmic thump. This was not a punishment. Beatrice never acted out of spite. She acted out of strategy. The cottage was isolated. It was off the grid. She was removing me from the noise of the family, placing me in a space where I could focus. She was giving me an assignment. I looked up at Julian. "I accept the terms." Julian gave a curt nod. He pushed the key and the ledger across the table. "The 30-day clock begins at sundown today." I gathered the ledger and the key, dropping them into my canvas tote bag. I walked out of the law office without looking back at my family. The Burlington air hit my lungs like swallowed glass. The snow squall had intensified, blanketing the streets in a thick layer of white. I climbed into my Subaru. The engine turned over with a rough, protesting cough before settling into a rattling idle. I turned the heater onto the highest setting, but it only blew lukewarm air against the frozen windshield. The drive to Stowe took over an hour in the mounting storm. The roads wound through dense forests of bare maples and snow-wade pines. The steady slap of the windshield wipers served as a metronome for my racing thoughts. I pictured my grandmother sitting in her study, drinking her peppermint tea, calculating this exact scenario. Beatrice did not build a legacy by leaving things to chance. If she left me a locked ledger, it contained answers. If she demanded I stay in the cottage, she knew the thick timber walls provided something the main house could not: protection, secrecy. I knew the saltbox cottage well. It was built in the late 18th century, a rare surviving relic from the original logging claim that predated our family's arrival in Vermont. Beatrice had spent a small fortune preserving its structural integrity while refusing to modernize the interior. It possessed no central heating, no running hot water, and a roof pitched steep enough to shed the heavy northern snows. But I also knew it had a functional stone hearth, capable of holding a fire through the night, a hand-pumped well fed by a deep groundwater spring, and shelves lined with antique oil lamps. Because of my profession, I spent my days analyzing the intricate weave structures and natural fiber durability of colonial-era textiles. I understood the physical reality of historical living. I knew how the people who built that cottage survived the relentless winters. I could do it. But as I turned off the main highway and onto the private access road leading to the back edge of the estate, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The snow on the access road was untouched, a pristine sheet of white stretching up the steep incline. My Subaru tires spun for a moment, fighting for traction, before the all-wheel drive caught. I crested the first steep hill, the dark silhouette of the weaver's cottage just barely visible through the falling snow ahead. Then I slammed on the brakes. The Subaru fishtailed, the anti-lock brakes grinding against the packed ice. The car slid to a halt inches from a wall of dark, polished metal. There, parked horizontally across the narrowest point of the access road, was a pristine black luxury SUV. It was Cynthia's vehicle. She had not driven it to the law office today. She had sent it ahead. The SUV was wedged perfectly between two thick oak trunks, creating an impassable barrier. There was no room to drive around it. The snowbanks on either side were too steep, dropping off into a rocky ravine. I put the car in park, leaving the engine running, and stepped out into the freezing wind. The cold bit into the exposed skin of my face immediately. I trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the barrier. I wiped a layer of frost from the driver's side window and peered inside. The interior was spotless and empty. The keys were gone. Cynthia had orchestrated this trap long before Julian ever opened that manila envelope. She had inside information regarding the conditions of the blind trust, or she had guessed Beatrice's final play. By blocking the only functional road to the cottage, she was engineering a physical blockade to force a legal default. She knew that if I could not physically haul myself and my supplies to the property line before the sun disappeared, or if I retreated to town to hire a private tow truck, the 30-day residency clause would be forfeited. The contract would void. I stood in the swirling snow, the wind biting through my wool coat. The sun was already beginning to dip behind the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The deadline was less than an hour away. Cynthia thought a locked car and a freezing mountain would make me quit. She thought I was the weak, quiet niece who sold old blankets for a living. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cold, heavy brass key. I turned off the ignition. The Subaru shuddered into silence, leaving only the sound of the wind howling through the Green Mountain pines. Cynthia thought a parked luxury vehicle would serve as an impenetrable fortress. She calculated that I would sit in my driver's seat, watch the fuel gauge drop, and eventually turn back toward the warm lights of Burlington. She misjudged my stubbornness. I slung the canvas tote bag over my shoulder, pulled my wool collar tight against my jaw, and stepped into the knee-deep drift. The incline was steep. My leather boots broke the crust of the snow with hollow crunches, each step requiring deliberate force. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting the forest in a bruised twilight. Pine branches snapped under the weight of the accumulating ice. My lungs burned with the frigid air, but I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead. It took 20 minutes of grueling uphill waiting before the dark silhouette of the saltbox cottage emerged from the tree line. Built 3 centuries ago, the structure possessed a severe, unadorned geometry. A steeply pitched roof designed to shed heavy snowfall, narrow windows meant to conserve heat, and untreated cedar shingles weathered to a pale silver. It was a survivalist architecture. I stepped onto the covered porch, stamping the snow from my boots. My fingers were numb as I retrieved the old iron key Beatrice kept hidden under a loose floorboard. The deadbolt groaned, protesting the bitter chill, but the door swung open. I stepped over the threshold into pitch blackness. The interior air was stagnant and colder than the wind outside, trapped and refrigerated within the thick timber walls. I reached for the wall switch near the doorframe and flipped it upward. Nothing happened. I flicked it down and up again. No hum of electricity, no amber glow from the overhead bulbs. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I walked back out onto the porch and waded around the side of the structure to the utility meter. The gray metal box hung against the cedar siding. Beneath it, the thick black conduit pipe that fed power from the municipal line hung loose. The rubber casing was cleanly sliced, exposing the severed copper wiring inside. A bright yellow tag fluttered from the metal clasp, bearing the logo of a local Stowe contracting firm. The handwriting on the tag read, "Winterization Disconnect, authorized by Cynthia Hall." Cynthia had not just blocked the road. She had weaponized the Vermont winter. She knew the clause required me to survive here without outside financial assistance. Hiring an emergency electrician on a holiday weekend would cost thousands, money I did not have, and it would technically violate the terms Julian read at the mahogany table. She intended to freeze me out before midnight. I returned to the interior, closing the heavy oak door to seal out the storm. The darkness was total. I navigated the familiar layout by memory, sliding my hands along the rough-hewn walls until my fingertips brushed the cold stone of the central hearth. I felt along the wooden mantel until I located a glass hurricane lamp and a rectangular cardboard box. I pulled a long wooden match from the carton. I struck the sulfur head against the abrasive strip. The spark flared, catching the wood and blooming into a steady orange teardrop. I lifted the glass chimney and touched the flame to the braided cotton wick. The golden light spilled outward, pushing back the shadows. The warm glow danced across the wide plank pine floors and illuminated the center of the room. There stood Beatrice's antique floor loom, a magnificent contraption of polished oak and tensioned strings. It stood tall and unyielding, a silent testament to the women who had occupied this space before me. The sight of it grounded my racing pulse. I was an appraiser. I knew how to handle historical artifacts. Now, I just had to live in one. But surviving required heat. I turned to the stone hearth. It was empty. The kindling bin beside it contained nothing but a thin layer of dust. Cynthia had been thorough. She had ordered the property stripped of firewood. The temperature inside the cottage was already dropping below freezing. Without a fire, the structure would become a wooden tomb by morning. I wrapped my arms around my chest, calculating how many floorboards I could pry up and burn before compromising the foundation, when a low, mechanical rumble vibrated through the floor. It was not the wind. It was a heavy diesel engine. I moved to the narrow front window and wiped away the condensation. Headlights swept across the frosted glass, cutting a blinding arc through the blizzard. A heavy-duty pickup truck broke through the tree line, ignoring the blocked access road entirely by plowing over the brush and snowbanks adjacent to the ravine. The truck rumbled to a halt near the porch. The driver's side door swung open. A woman stepped out into the storm, pulling a heavy canvas parka tight around her frame. It was Maya. Maya was my brother Ethan's wife. She was a commercial architect, a brilliant African-American woman who designed structural load-bearing frameworks for high-rise developments in Boston. She possessed a mind engineered for finding weaknesses in foundations. She had always viewed my Aunt Cynthia with profound skepticism, recognizing the difference between authentic wealth and a leveraged facade. I threw the front door open. Maya trudged up the porch stairs carrying 2 thick bundles of foil-wrapped thermal blankets. "You are freezing," she said, pushing past me into the cottage. "What are you doing here?" I asked, shutting the door against the howling wind. "Ethan told you to stay out of the estate proceedings." Maya dropped the blankets onto the rustic dining table. "Ethan tells me a lot of things. He also told me Cynthia was just being practical when she parked her luxury tank across the road. I checked the weather patterns. I knew this storm was dumping 10 inches tonight. I also know your aunt. She does not play fair." She went back out to her truck and returned carrying 2 thick canvas bags filled with seasoned birchwood and dry cedar kindling. She dumped the logs onto the stone hearth. "He forbade you from helping me," I said, watching her stack the kindling with architectural precision. "If Cynthia finds out you came here, she will punish him." Maya struck a match and tossed it into the hearth. The dry cedar caught instantly, sending a welcome wave of heat into the freezing room. She stood up, brushing the sawdust from her gloves. Her dark eyes met mine, steady and fiercely intelligent. "Ethan is letting his fear dictate his loyalty," Maya said softly. "Blood makes you related, but showing up when the power lines are cut, that is what makes you family. Cynthia thinks she can bully you into abandoning this property so she can liquidate it. I am not going to let her win on a technicality." Maya's defiance hung in the air, a stark contrast to my brother's passive cowardice. She was risking her own marriage to ensure I had a fighting chance. "I cannot pay you for this wood," I warned her. "The contract forbids financial assistance." "Consider it a housewarming gift," Maya replied, zipping her parka. "I have to go. If I stay, she could argue you did not reside here alone. Keep the fire fed. Lock the door." I watched from the window as her truck carved a fresh path down the mountain, her taillights disappearing into the whiteout conditions. The cottage was no longer a tomb. The hearth fire roared, the thick stones absorbing and radiating the heat. The temperature climbed, thawing the chill from my bones. I walked to the dining table. I unbuttoned my coat and sat down on the wooden bench. From my canvas tote, I retrieved the heavy leather ledger and the tarnished brass key. The firelight flickered across the cracked leather binding. The scent of peppermint oil grew stronger as the material warmed. I slid the brass key into the small padlock securing the cover. The internal tumbler shifted with a heavy, satisfying metallic click. The lock sprang open. I pulled the hasp free and opened the thick cover. I expected to find a traditional diary, perhaps a letter explaining why she left me nothing in the primary will, perhaps a list of final wishes or apologies. What I found made my breath catch in my throat. The thick parchment pages were not filled with narrative paragraphs. They were ruled into precise columns. The columns were filled with dates, names, interest rates, and staggering dollar amounts. Beside these figures, written in Beatrice's flawless, slanted cursive with a striking red ink, were meticulous annotations. It was not a diary. It was a cipher. It was a master record of every hidden transaction, every leveraged favor, and every broken promise. I traced my finger down the first page, reading the red ink. I realized in an instant that my grandmother had not left me an empty inheritance. She had left me a loaded weapon. The birch logs popped and hissed in the stone hearth, spitting bright orange embers against the blackened brick. I sat at the rustic dining table, the kerosene lamp casting a halo of golden light across the open ledger. The air in the cottage smelled of wood smoke, melting frost, and the sharp medicinal tang of peppermint oil rising from the ancient paper. I traced my index finger down the first column. Beatrice possessed a penmanship that belonged to a bygone era. Her cursive was flawless, angled with mathematical precision, written in a stark black ink that cut through the thick parchment. As an appraiser, I spent my entire career authenticating provenance. I examined the physical evidence left behind by history to separate the genuine articles from the counterfeits. My family, I quickly realized, was a collection of cheap counterfeits. Beatrice was not merely a wealthy widow tending to her rose gardens. She was the silent, unacknowledged bankroll for every single relative who had sneered at me across Julian Pierce's conference table. I turned the heavy page, the parchment rough against my skin. The header read, Cynthia Hall, Luxury Imports. My aunt had spent the last decade cultivating the public image of a self-made titan. She gave keynote speeches at women in business seminars. She wore designer coats and boasted to local magazines about her razor-sharp business acumen. The Ledger told a different story. Cynthia had not built an empire. She had built a fragile house of cards balancing on her mother's checking account. I read through line after line of wire transfers. $50,000 to cover warehouse payroll, $100,000 to secure a storefront lease in Boston. But it was the margins that caught my breath. Beatrice did not just record the financial figures. She kept a moral accounting. My finger stopped near the bottom of the page. The ink color shifted from stark black to a vibrant, unforgiving red. I read the annotation aloud, my voice echoing in the empty firelit room. April 14th, wired $200,000 to save Cynthia's third quarter margins. Asked her to stay for tea. She said her driver was waiting outside. The tea went cold. Interest applied, 8%. The words hit me right in the chest. I stared at the red ink until the letters blurred. I remembered that specific day. I remembered pulling into the estate driveway and seeing Cynthia's black SUV speeding away toward the highway. I remembered walking into the main house and finding Beatrice sitting alone at the kitchen island, staring at 2 porcelain cups, the steam long gone. The emotional weight of the ledger shifted the ground beneath my feet. I was not just reading a record of financial ruin. I was reading the itemized receipt of an old woman's profound loneliness. Cynthia took the money to save her vanity project and could not spare 15 minutes to sit with the mother who rescued her. Beatrice penalized her for the cruelty, quietly adding interest to the debt of a broken heart. I turned another page. Ethan. My brother projected the image of a savvy real estate developer. He drove European sports cars and wore tailored suits to family dinners. According to the Ledger, his last 3 property flips were entirely underwritten by Beatrice. When a contractor walked off a job site downtown, Beatrice paid the settlement. When a foundation cracked and the bank threatened foreclosure, Beatrice wired the bailout funds. Next came Chloe. My cousin portrayed herself as a global lifestyle influencer, posting photos from luxury resorts in Dubai and Paris. The Ledger revealed those trips were not sponsored by high-end travel brands. They were funded by emergency cash requests sent to her grandmother. I found a $20,000 transfer for a chartered yacht off the Amalfi Coast. Beatrice's red ink simply noted, Chloe called in tears regarding her brand image, paid the boat captain, did not receive a thank you card. They were parasites. They drained her wealth to fund their arrogant public facades, and then they had the audacity to mock me for authenticating historic textiles. Beatrice had watched them do it year after year. She kept the receipts. And then she locked those receipts inside this leather binder, handed me the brass key, and forced me into isolation so I could read them without distraction. She gave me the sword to execute the family's sins. The sudden vibration of my cell phone shattered the quiet. The device rattled against the wooden table, the screen illuminating the dark room with a harsh blue glow. The caller ID displayed Cynthia's name. I checked my watch. It was past midnight. The storm outside continued to rage, throwing ice against the narrow window panes. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. Megan, Cynthia said. Her voice dripped with a synthetic, honeyed concern that mirrored the cheap fabric of the sweater she wore at the law office. I am so glad you have a cell signal out there. I have been worrying about you all night. I watched the firelight dance across the red ink in the ledger. "Is that why you hired a crew to sever the power lines?" I asked. Cynthia let out a soft, dismissive sigh. That was a scheduled winterization. The contractor simply moved the timetable up due to the storm warnings. But listen to me, sweetheart. I know you want to prove a point. You want to honor your grandmother. But the temperature is dropping into the single digits. That old shack is an icebox. It is bad for your health to play pioneer woman. "I am perfectly warm," I replied, my tone flat and unyielding. Cynthia ignored the pushback. "I want to help you, Megan. I am willing to write you a personal check right now, $10,000. You pack your bags, walk down the mountain, and check into a warm suite at the lodge in town. You can start your own little antique shop with the money. You do not need to suffer out there for a blind trust that probably contains a few old savings bonds." She was fishing. She wanted to know if I had opened the ledger. She wanted to know if I understood the leverage I now held in my hands. I closed the leather cover. The brass padlock clinked against the hardwood table. "I do not need your money, Cynthia. I am staying for the 30 days. The honeyed concern evaporated. The silence on the line grew sharp, vibrating with a sudden, naked hostility. "You are an arrogant, ungrateful girl," Cynthia spat, the venom finally bleeding through her polished facade. "You think sitting in the dark makes you superior? You think you were going to wait me out and claim some grand prize? I was trying to be generous to my sister's child." "You were trying to buy a default," I corrected her. Cynthia let out a harsh, jagged breath. "You want to play hardball? Fine. I know the local zoning commissioner. That cottage is not up to code. It lacks basic sanitation and heating infrastructure. I am calling a judge first thing in the morning. I am going to have that property condemned as a health hazard. The sheriff will drag you off that mountain by noon tomorrow, and your little residency contract will be voided. Enjoy your last night in the cold, Megan." The line went dead. I lowered the phone to the table. The warfare had officially begun. Cynthia thought she was fighting a simple real estate battle over a plot of land. She did not realize I was sitting in the dark, armed with the exact dollar amount it would take to dismantle her entire life. I walked over to the hearth, placed another birch log onto the fire, and began preparing for the morning. The morning of the 5th day broke clear and bitter. Cynthia never sent the sheriff. The local zoning office operated at a glacial pace during the winter months, and even my aunt could not bribe a judge to issue an emergency condemnation order over a holiday weekend. She realized bureaucratic warfare would take too long. I needed to be broken faster. If they could not freeze me out, they decided to starve me out. The strategy shifted away from Cynthia and landed squarely in the manicured hands of my cousin. Chloe orchestrated her attack from the comfort of her Boston penthouse. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. My cell phone, sitting on the rustic dining table, vibrated against the wood. Then it vibrated again. A sudden, relentless sequence of notifications flooded the screen. I picked up the device and opened my email inbox. The messages were coming from my most trusted clients, gallery directors, museum curators, and private textile collectors who had relied on my expertise for years. The subject lines read like an obituary for my career. Cancellation of services, inquiry regarding authentication methods, urgent review of provenance. I opened a message from a prominent Boston Historical Society. They were terminating my contract to appraise a collection of Revolutionary War uniforms. The director cited a sudden influx of disturbing online reports regarding my professional integrity. I switched over to my business profile on the major review directories. My perfect 5-star rating had plummeted to a dismal 1. Overnight, dozens of anonymous accounts had posted scathing reviews. They accused me of authenticating forged colonial fabrics, inflating appraisal values for kickbacks, and scamming elderly collectors out of their family heirlooms. Chloe possessed a digital empire. She commanded millions of followers, a vast network of automated bot accounts, and PR fixers who specialized in manipulating online algorithms. She had weaponized that infrastructure to destroy my livelihood. In the niche, insular world of antique textiles, reputation is the only currency that matters. A single rumor of fraud can end a career. Chloe was saturating the market with a tidal wave of fabricated incompetence. My phone chimed again. Another client canceling a consultation. I stood in the center of the saltbox cottage, the frigid air biting at my cheeks. The urge to panic flared in my chest. If my business collapsed, I would have zero income when I finally left this mountain. They were trying to manufacture a financial panic, hoping I would abandon the residency clause to rush back to civilization and salvage my firm. I set the phone face down on the table. I refused to let Chloe dictate my heart rate. I needed to ground myself in the physical world, to touch something authentic. My eyes drifted to the far wall of the cottage, where Beatrice had hung a magnificent textile piece. It was a mid-19th century trapunto stuffed work quilt. Trapunto is a labor-intensive quilting technique where patterns are outlined with tiny running stitches, and then the spaces between the stitches are stuffed with yarn or cotton batting to create a raised, three-dimensional motif. This particular piece featured an elaborate feather wreath design framed by a border of indigo-dyed calico. I had admired it since I was a child. I walked over to the wall and ran my fingertips over the raised feathers. The tactile sensation usually calmed me, but as I traced the edge of the border, my trained eye caught an anomaly. The front face of the quilt was a genuine antique, the cotton softened by a century of wear. The backing fabric, however, felt stiff. I stepped closer, tilting the kerosene lamp to illuminate the seams. The thread binding the front layer to the muslin backing possessed a subtle, unnatural sheen. I squinted at the microscopic loops. Authentic 19th century quilts were constructed using spun cotton or linen thread. This thread reflected the lamplight with a synthetic glare. It was nylon. Nylon thread did not exist until the 20th century. Furthermore, the stitching pattern was too uniform, lacking the slight organic variations of hand sewing. It had been run through a modern sewing machine. Beatrice was a purist. She never would have allowed a crude, modern repair on a museum-quality textile, unless the repair served a functional, hidden purpose. I walked back to my tote bag and retrieved my appraisal kit. I pulled out a sharp steel seam ripper. Returning to the quilt, I carefully inserted the curved blade under the synthetic thread. With a precise upward motion, I snapped the nylon loop. I worked methodically along the bottom edge, unpicking the weft and separating the antique front from the modern backing. As the seam opened, a stiff corner of pale yellow paper peeked out from behind the raw cotton batting. My breath caught. The cottage was not merely a rustic shelter. It was an escape room constructed by a brilliant mind. Beatrice had transformed her historic artifacts into a secure vault. I reached into the hollow cavity of the trapunto quilt and extracted a thick manila folder. I carried the folder to the dining table and flipped it open under the lantern light. The contents had nothing to do with textiles or antiques. It was a dense stack of legal correspondence, financial settlements, and non-disclosure agreements. The first document was a cease and desist letter from an independent jewelry designer in Brooklyn, accusing Chloe Hall Lifestyle Brands of blatant intellectual property theft. The designer claimed Chloe had stolen her proprietary necklace designs, mass-produced them overseas, and marketed them as her own original creations. Attached to the letter was a cashed settlement check for $50,000, signed by Beatrice. I flipped through the pages. There were 6 different settlements. Chloe had built her entire influencer persona on the illusion of creative genius. In reality, she was a serial plagiarist, stealing designs from struggling artists and relying on her grandmother to quietly pay off the victims before they went to the press. Each NDA was countersigned by Beatrice, accompanied by a familiar red ink annotation in the margins. Chloe requested another bailout today, Beatrice had written on a document dated just 3 months prior to her death. She threatened to block my number if I refused to pay the artist. Funds wired. She is a hollow girl building a hollow life. Chloe was attacking my professional integrity, unaware that I now held the documented proof of her own corporate fraud. If these NDAs leaked to her sponsors or the fashion media, her brand would face immediate termination and severe civil litigation. Her digital empire would crumble in an afternoon. My phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. This time, the caller ID displayed Maya's name. I answered immediately. "Megan," Maya said, her voice crackling over the weak cellular connection. "Have you checked your business pages today?" "I am watching the reviews roll in right now," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the panic Chloe hoped to inspire. Maya let out a sharp breath. "I saw them an hour ago." I knew Cynthia lacked the technological literacy to coordinate a bot attack, so I called in a favor. The head of IT security at my architectural firm owes me for fixing a structural flaw in his home renovation. I asked him to run a trace on the IP addresses flooding your directory pages. "What did he find?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "The reviews are being routed through proxy servers," Maya explained. "But my guy is good. He traced the primary origin cluster straight back to a luxury condominium building in the Seaport district of Boston. Chloe's building." "Exactly," Maya confirmed. "She hired a digital reputation management firm to nuke your business. I have the IP logs and the digital footprint connecting the attack directly to her residential network. I can send the file to your phone." "Send it," I instructed. "And Maya, thank you." "Do not thank me yet," she warned. "This is just the opening salvo. If Chloe is deploying her resources, Ethan and Cynthia are plotting their next move. You need to stay alert." "I will," I promised. I ended the call and listened to the satisfying chime of Maya's file downloading to my device. I had the digital tracking data linking Chloe to the smear campaign, and I had the analog paper trail proving she was a corporate thief. I reached for the heavy leather ledger sitting beside the lantern. I unlocked the brass padlock and opened the binding to the section dedicated to Chloe's offshore accounts. I uncapped my pen. Beneath Beatrice's meticulous red notes, I added a line of my own in stark black ink. I documented the date, the IP tracking evidence provided by Maya, and the existence of the NDAs hidden inside the trapunto quilt. The ledger was no longer just a record of the past, it was an active, breathing ledger of the present war. Chloe had fired her best shot, attempting to burn my reputation to the ground. She failed to realize her own house was soaked in gasoline, and I was sitting in the dark, holding the match. The digital attack was neutralized by the secrets woven into the walls of the cottage. I spent the next few days in quiet routine, splitting firewood, melting snow for drinking water, and ignoring the hollow threats piling up in my email inbox. But the silence on the mountain was temporary. As the morning of the 11th day broke, the wind died down, leaving a thick, unnatural stillness over the forest. The snow stopped falling. I was standing by the hearth, stoking the morning embers, when a sharp, distinct sound echoed from the porch. It was the crunch of a heavy boot stepping onto the frozen floorboards. Someone had navigated the access road, and they were standing right outside my door. The mountain became a silent tomb after Chloe's proxy war collapsed. The fake reviews remained on my directory pages, but the frantic energy of the digital assault faded into the Vermont winter. Chloe retreated into the shadows, realizing her own corporate theft was one keystroke away from public exposure. The silence should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like the receding tide before a tsunami. The villains were merely changing their tactics. The second week belonged to Ethan. My older brother always played the role of the reluctant peacemaker at family gatherings. He wore tailored Italian wool, drove a slate-gray European sedan, and ordered expensive scotch with the practiced ease of a successful real estate developer. But his success was an illusion, crafted by Beatrice's checkbook. Without her capital to pad his margins and cover his failed property flips, Ethan was starving. And starvation breeds a special kind of desperation. By day 15, I had settled into a grueling physical rhythm. Survival in the saltbox cottage demanded constant labor. I spent my mornings outside, swinging a heavy iron splitting maul against thick rounds of frozen birch. The repetitive motion kept my blood warm and my mind sharp. I left the heavy oak door unlocked during these chores, trusting the remote location and the steep incline to keep unwanted visitors at bay. It was a rare vulnerability. After carrying a towering stack of firewood onto the porch, I retreated inside to tend the hearth. Once the flames caught the dry cedar, I turned my attention to the wide pine floorboards. Beatrice had insulated the drafty floor with several antique coverings to trap the ambient heat. One piece in the center of the room demanded closer inspection. It was a mid-19th century jacquard woven rug. The textile utilized a complex mordant dyeing process, a historical technique where metallic salts were used to fix vibrant madder reds and deep indigo blues permanently into the wool fibers. I knelt beside the heavy fabric, running my trained fingertips over the reversible geometric patterns. Something felt uneven beneath the thick weave. The floor dipped slightly under the pressure of my palm. I rolled the heavy rug back, exposing the raw timber planks. One specific board lacked the square, hand-forged iron nails securing the rest of the floor. I retrieved a flathead screwdriver from my appraisal kit and wedged it into the seam. With a sharp twist, the plank popped loose. Beneath the floorboard lay a shallow, hollowed-out cavity. Resting inside was a thick, black leather portfolio. I pulled it out and opened it by the firelight. This was not a continuation of the moral debt ledger. These documents contained Ethan's private demons. The pages were filled with offshore wire transfer receipts routed through anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Behind those were urgent collection notices from illicit sports betting syndicates. The sums were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars squandered on high-stakes gambling over the past 4 years. Beatrice had bailed him out twice, the red ink in the margins noting her profound disappointment in his lack of discipline. But the most recent notices remained unpaid. The debt was compounding daily. The syndicates were threatening physical collection. This was the true reason Ethan accepted his portion of the will without a single word of protest. He needed the domestic stock portfolio to liquidate immediately. But even that was not enough. He needed Cynthia to sell the entire estate to commercial developers so he could claim his percentage before his creditors arrived at his doorstep. While I uncovered his financial ruin by the hearth, another drama unfolded just beyond the timber walls. Ethan had driven up the mountain, parking his sedan half a mile down the access road to avoid the engine noise echoing through the trees. He trekked through the snow, cornered and frantic. He assumed I was still at the woodpile behind the cottage. He crept onto the side porch, pulling a flat steel pry bar from the pocket of his cashmere overcoat. He targeted the eastern window, hoping to force the frozen sash, slip inside, and steal the brass key and the ledger. He underestimated the women in his life. Maya had driven up the mountain that same afternoon to deliver fresh provisions. She parked her truck silently near the lower tree line, noticing the fresh, hurried footprints leading up the path. She followed them. As Ethan jammed the steel bar under the wooden window frame, he shifted his weight backward to gain leverage. His designer leather boot stepped squarely onto a discarded piece of antique spindlewood resting near the porch railing. The dry, aged timber snapped. The sickening crunch echoed like a rifle shot in the crisp, dead air of the forest. Ethan froze. He turned his head slowly. Maya stood at the bottom of the porch stairs holding a canvas grocery bag filled with canned goods. The look on her face was not anger. It was a cold, devastating disgust. Ethan, the polished executive, stood shivering in the snow like a common burglar, holding a crowbar against his own grandmother's house. Maya did not yell. She spoke with a quiet precision that cut deeper than any shout. "Put the tool down, Ethan." He stammered, his breath puffing in white clouds. He tried to weave a pathetic lie about checking the structural integrity of the window frames to ensure I was safe from the drafts. Maya dropped the canvas bag onto the snow. "You are trying to rob your sister," she said, her voice hollow and uncompromising. "You are trying to steal the only leverage she has because you are drowning." I heard the voices through the thin glass. I walked to the window and looked out. I saw my brother drop the steel bar. It plunged into the snowbank, disappearing from sight. His shoulders slumped, the manufactured posture of a successful man collapsing inward. Maya turned her back on him. She walked up the stairs, stepped around him as if he were nothing more than debris, and knocked on the heavy oak door. I unlocked the deadbolt and let her in. Ethan remained on the porch for a long, agonizing moment before retreating down the mountain, leaving a trail of cowardly footprints in his wake. Maya stood by the hearth, unwinding her scarf. Her hands shook. The tremors were not born from the winter chill, but from the shattering of her marriage. The man she vowed to build a life with was a ghost. I handed her the black portfolio I had just unearthed from beneath the jacquard rug. She opened it. I watched her dark eyes scan the offshore receipts and the syndicate threats. The final illusion of her husband evaporated into the wood smoke. He was not a struggling businessman. He was a parasite, willing to destroy his own sister to save his own skin. Maya closed the portfolio. She stared into the roaring flames, her jaw set with a new, terrifying resolve. "He is going to call Cynthia the second he gets into his car," Maya whispered. "He is desperate, and a desperate man makes reckless alliances. If he cannot steal the ledger quietly, they will realize they have to take this land by force before the 30 days expire. We need to call Julian. Cynthia is going to bring the law." The residency clause dictated that I could not vacate the premises for a single night. It did not prohibit a daytime excursion to secure legal counsel. I locked the heavy oak door of the saltbox cottage just after sunrise. The storm had broken over the course of the night, leaving the Vermont mountain encased in a brilliant, blinding layer of ice. I navigated the Subaru down the treacherous access road, my tires crunching over the frozen footprints left by my brother Ethan the day before. I drove 20 miles past Stowe to a forgotten stretch of rural highway. The diner sat near an old logging route. It was a faded aluminum structure with a neon sign that buzzed like a trapped hornet. The interior smelled of dark roast coffee and old frying oil. It was the perfect place for a covert meeting. Julian Pierce sat in a back corner booth. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked sharply out of place against the cracked red vinyl seating. Julian was not merely a probate attorney. He was a tactician. He had started his career in the 1980s as a corporate raider in Manhattan before relocating to Vermont for a quieter life. Beatrice hired him 3 decades ago specifically for his ruthless understanding of asset protection. He viewed corporate statutes the way a surgeon viewed a scalpel. He did not waste time with pleasantries. As I slid into the booth opposite him, he folded his hands over a thick leather briefcase resting on the table. "You survived the first 2 weeks," Julian stated, his tone analytical. "I survived a digital smear campaign and an attempted burglary," I replied, keeping my voice low so the waitress wiping down the counter could not hear. "Ethan tried to pry open a window yesterday to steal the ledger. My sister-in-law caught him." Julian did not look surprised. Desperation accelerates bad decisions. "Did you bring the brass key?" I reached into my coat pocket and placed the heavy, tarnished metal onto the table. It landed with a dull thud. "I unlocked the leather binder," I told him. "I read the moral debt ledger. I also found 2 hidden caches inside the cottage." Chloe signed non-disclosure agreements for intellectual property theft. Ethan is drowning in offshore syndicate debt. Beatrice funded their entire lives. Julian picked up the key, turning it over in his palm. Beatrice funded their illusions, he corrected, and she never handed out a single dollar without securing her investment. He unclasped his briefcase. He did not pull out a standard legal pad. He withdrew a stack of heavy, legal-sized folders. That key does not just open a padlock on an old book, Julian explained. It corresponds to a private vault at a regional bank in Burlington. As the executor of the estate, I was authorized to extract these preliminary files once you verified possession of the ledger. He placed his hand flat against the top folder. The items you found hidden in the quilts and the floorboards are the emotional receipts. These are the corporate realities. Julian pushed the first document toward me. The paper was pristine, thick, archival-grade rag cotton. As it slid across the faded Formica tabletop, it produced a crisp, satisfying hiss. The harsh fluorescent lights of the diner caught the subtle indentation of a state seal watermark embossed into the top right corner. I looked down at the header. It read, Granite Holdings, LLC. Your grandmother established this blind trust 20 years ago, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet authority. She did not operate a charity for her children. When Cynthia demanded seed capital to launch her luxury brand, Beatrice did not write a blank check. She required Cynthia to sign a pledge agreement. When Ethan needed bailouts for his failing real estate developments, Beatrice filed UCC-1 financing statements against his operating companies. I stared at the intricate legal jargon covering the page. As an appraiser, I analyzed the weave of historical fabrics to determine authenticity. Now, I was analyzing the weave of corporate law. The implications began to form a staggering picture in my mind. A UCC-1 financing statement is a public declaration of a lien. It gives notice that a creditor has a legal interest in the personal property of a debtor. It establishes priority in case of default. They are not unsecured loans, I whispered, tracing the typed ink on the page. Precisely, Julian said. Beatrice secured every penny she gave them against their tangible assets. She holds the liens on Cynthia's warehouse inventory and brand trademarks. She holds the equity in Chloe's Boston condominium. She holds the controlling voting rights in Ethan's commercial properties. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto mine. And as the incoming trustee of Granite Holdings, you do not just own their debt. You own the collateral. The diner faded into the background. The clatter of silverware and the low hum of the refrigeration units vanished. I sat suspended in the terrifying gravity of the revelation. I was not a marginalized niece fighting to keep a drafty historic cottage. I was the incoming majority equity stakeholder of their entire lives. Beatrice had structured a delayed hostile corporate takeover, and she had placed me at the head of the board. If you execute these liens, Julian continued, tapping the watermarked paper, you can legally seize Cynthia's company. You can freeze her operational accounts. You can liquidate Ethan's assets to pay off his syndicate debts before they break his legs, leaving him with nothing. You can foreclose on Chloe's lifestyle. You hold the nuclear codes to the Hall family empire. I touched the edge of the document. The power was intoxicating. A sudden surge of adrenaline demanded immediate retaliation for every sneer, every stolen opportunity, and every insult they had thrown at me across that mahogany conference table. I wanted to drive straight to Stowe, kick open the doors of the main estate, and hand them their eviction notices. Julian saw the shift in my posture. He reached out and placed his hand firmly over the documents, sliding them back toward his briefcase. Not yet, he warned, his voice cutting through my rising fury. Why not? I challenged. I have the proof. I have the key. Because the trust is conditional, Julian stated. Granite Holdings remains dormant until the 30-day residency clause is fulfilled. If you confront them now, if you reveal the existence of these pledge agreements, Cynthia will file an emergency injunction in federal court. She will claim you extorted the information. She will tie the estate up in litigation for a decade. He locked the briefcase. The metallic snap echoed in our quiet booth. More importantly, Julian added, if you fail to complete the remaining 15 days in the cottage, if you vacate the premises for a single night, the trust legally dissolves. The assets default to a listed charity. Cynthia, Ethan, and Chloe will walk away free from their debts. They will keep everything, and you will lose the only leverage you have. The reality of the trap settled over me like a heavy winter quilt. I had to go back to the mountain. I had to sit in the freezing timber box, chop wood, and wait. They are not going to stop attacking me, I said, looking out the diner window at the frozen landscape. Ethan failed. The digital smear failed. Cynthia is running out of time to sell the main estate before her own creditors come calling. Julian nodded slowly, his expression grim. You are correct. Ethan was a minor nuisance. Cynthia is a different caliber of threat. She does not play small, and she does not tolerate failure. She will escalate. She will shift from petty sabotage to institutional force. She will try to utilize the law, or men with badges, to physically remove you from that property. He slid out of the booth, adjusting his suit jacket. Go back to the cottage, Megan. Keep the fires burning. Keep your doors bolted. Survive the final 2 weeks and do not let them know you hold the blade until it is already pressed against their throats. I watched Julian walk out of the diner and step into the freezing Vermont air. I picked up the brass key from the Formica table and slipped it back into my pocket. The metal felt heavier now. It carried the weight of impending ruin. I drove back up the mountain under a steel gray sky. The silence of the forest was no longer a comfort. It felt like a held breath. Cynthia was out there, plotting her next offensive, believing she was fighting a peasant for a piece of historic real estate. She was about to deploy her final strategy, and I had to brace for the impact. The silence of the Vermont mountain was deceptive. While I sat in the saltbox cottage, feeding birch logs into the hearth and waiting out the residency clock, the pressure cooker of my family's financial ruin was detonating 50 miles away. The narrative fracture did not begin with Cynthia's grand schemes. It began in the sterile, ultra-modern kitchen of Ethan and Maya's condominium in downtown Burlington. Maya arrived home late that evening. She did not take off her coat. She walked directly to the massive marble kitchen island, unzipped her leather tote, and withdrew the thick black portfolio I had unearthed from beneath the jacquard rug. Ethan was sitting at the dining table, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, scrolling through real estate listings on his tablet. He looked up, expecting his wife to offer her usual, quiet support. He saw the black leather instead. Maya did not shout. She simply laid the documents flat against the cold marble. The papers fanned out, the offshore wire receipts, the syndicate collection notices, the compounding interest calculations. Ethan stared at the papers, his face drained of color. The carefully constructed facade of the successful developer crumbled in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin a narrative of temporary cash flow issues, but the words died in his throat. How much? Maya asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the frantic energy Ethan relied upon to manipulate his environment. Ethan swallowed hard, staring at his reflection in the dark granite countertop. 400,000, he whispered, his voice trembling, and it grows every week. The sports books do not renegotiate, Maya. They demand immediate liquidity. Maya stood perfectly still, her architectural mind processing the structural collapse of her life. You tried to steal from your own sister to save yourself. You took a crowbar to your grandmother's house while she was chopping wood. I was desperate, Ethan pleaded, standing up and reaching for her arm. She stepped back, out of his reach. Cynthia has a plan, Maya. She found a commercial developer out of New York. They want to turn the Stowe estate into a luxury eco-resort. They are willing to pay $12 million in cash, closing in 7 days. Maya's eyes narrowed. The estate is tied up in probate. She cannot sell a single acre without clearing the title. Ethan shook his head frantically. That is exactly the point. Cynthia told the developers she holds the primary deed. They are expediting the title search. But the sale is contingent on immediate, vacant possession of the entire property. If Megan is sitting in that cottage, the developers will back out. Cynthia needs her gone before the end of the week. And how does Cynthia intend to accomplish that? Maya demanded, her voice hardening into steel. Ethan looked away, staring at the bourbon glass. She is not going to wait for the 30-day clause to expire. She is sending a private security contractor. They are going to forcibly evict Megan under the pretense of a trespass violation. They are going to drag her off that mountain tonight. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Ethan looked back at his wife, expecting her to help him formulate a defense. He expected the loyalty of a spouse to override the cruelty of his bloodline. He misjudged her entirely. Maya reached her left hand across her body. Her fingers gripped the diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band on her left hand. I married an ambitious man, Maya said softly. I did not marry a coward. She pulled the rings over her knuckle. Ethan stepped forward, panic finally breaking through his paralysis. Maya, please. If the sale goes through, I can pay the syndicates. We can start over. Maya set the rings down. The platinum bands hit the marble countertop with a sharp, metallic clink. The sound echoed through the sterile kitchen. A definitive period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. I am filing for separation in the morning, Maya stated. Do not call my office. She turned and walked out the door, leaving Ethan alone with his debt, his bourbon, and the echoes of a broken promise. Maya drove through the freezing night, her truck tearing up the steep, icy access road leading to the Stowe estate. She bypassed the barricaded SUV Cynthia had left behind, navigating the treacherous terrain with reckless precision. She arrived at the saltbox cottage just before midnight. I was reading by the hearth when she began pounding on the heavy oak door. I unbolted the lock, alarmed by the sheer violence of her knocking. Maya practically fell inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They are coming tonight, she said, pushing past me and shoving the heavy iron deadbolt back into place. Ethan told me everything. Cynthia found a commercial developer. They need the property vacant to close a $12 million sale. She hired private contractors to drag you out. I felt the blood drain from my face. Julian warned me that Cynthia would escalate, but I assumed she would deploy lawyers, not mercenaries. We need to call the police, I said, reaching for my cell phone on the dining table. Maya shook her head, pacing the length of the room. The local sheriff is not going to intervene in a civil dispute over an estate, especially when Cynthia is the one holding the primary will. They will view this as an eviction proceeding. By the time Julianne files an injunction, you will have been off the property for 24 hours and the trust will dissolve. You cannot leave this cabin. She was right. The residency clause was unforgiving. If I stepped foot off the property line, even under duress, Granite Holdings would vanish. Cynthia would win. I looked around the cottage. The structure was built 3 centuries ago to withstand brutal winters and wild predators. It possessed thick timber walls and narrow recessed windows. We could fortify it. I grabbed the heavy splitting maul resting by the hearth. Maya pulled an antique cast iron chair from the corner. Together, we dragged the massive oak dining table across the wide plank floor, wedging it firmly beneath the front doorknob. We piled the heavy wooden benches on top, creating a solid barricade against the frame. We moved to the narrow windows, driving thick iron nails through the wooden sashes, sealing them shut. The saltbox cottage became a fortress. We retreated to the center of the room, sitting on the floor near the hearth. The fire popped and hissed, the only sound in the suffocating silence. We waited. The minutes dragged into hours. The adrenaline that had fueled our frantic barricading began to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Maya sat with her knees pulled to her chest. I looked at her left hand. The bare skin where her rings used to sit was pale in the firelight. I did not ask her what happened. Her presence in this cottage, risking her own safety to protect mine, answered every question. She had chosen loyalty over blood. She had chosen the right side of the war. Suddenly, the stillness broke. Through the narrow glass at the front window, I saw the sweeping beam of high-intensity headlights cut through the darkness. The light pierced the tree line, illuminating the falling snow in harsh, chaotic strobes. The deep, guttural growl of heavy diesel engines vibrated through the floorboards. Maya gripped my arm. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the orange glow of the hearth. The vehicles rolled to a halt in the clearing just beyond the porch. The engines idled, a low, menacing rumble that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cottage. I heard the sharp, metallic slam of heavy truck doors closing. Then came the sound. It was deliberate, unhurried. The unmistakable crunch of heavy, tactical boots stepping onto the frozen snow. The footsteps moved in unison, a rhythmic, terrifying advance toward the porch stairs. They were not knocking. They were coming to breach. Cynthia had unleashed her final offensive, and there was nowhere left to run. The heavy boots crunched against the snow, stopping dead at the base of the porch stairs. Maya and I sat perfectly still by the hearth, the firelight casting long, trembling shadows against the timber walls. I clutched the heavy iron splitting maul, my knuckles white, preparing for the splintering crash of the door giving way. The silence stretched, tight and unbearable. Then came a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was not the violent kick of a breaching team. It was 3 sharp, polite raps against the heavy oak. A voice called out, muffled by the thick wood. Megan Hall. My name is Arthur Vance. I am here on behalf of your aunt, Cynthia Hall. I have authorization to evaluate the historical artifacts within the structure. Maya and I exchanged a bewildered glance. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by a profound, jarring confusion. They did not send mercenaries to drag me off the mountain. They sent an appraiser. I stood up, signaling for Maya to stay near the hearth. I walked to the door and unlocked the heavy deadbolt, swinging it open just a fraction. A man stood on the porch, illuminated by the halogen headlights of a black luxury SUV idling in the clearing. He wore a tailored camel hair overcoat and expensive leather gloves. He looked utterly out of place in the Vermont wilderness. He offered a tight, practiced smile, holding up a leather-bound clipboard. "Good evening," Arthur said, his tone slick and rehearsed. "I apologize for the late hour, but the impending sale of the estate requires an expedited inventory. Cynthia retained my services to assess the antique floor loom and any associated textiles for an upcoming auction in Manhattan." The strategy clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Cynthia realized a physical eviction would trigger immediate police intervention and potential criminal charges. She opted for institutional warfare instead. She hired a Trojan horse. This man was not here to evaluate the loom. He was a corporate spy sent to infiltrate the cottage, locate the ledger, and photograph the contents to assess exactly how much leverage I held. "I am an appraiser, Arthur," I said, maintaining a rigid stance in the doorway. "You should know that ethical guidelines dictate we do not conduct evaluations in the middle of a blizzard, in the dark, without proper environmental controls." He offered a condescending chuckle. "I understand the irregular conditions, but my client is highly motivated. I only need a few moments to document the pieces. It would be a shame to report to the executor that you obstructed a lawful estate inventory." He was threatening me with a breach of contract. If I refused him entry, Cynthia would argue to Julian Pierce that I was interfering with the estate's liquidation process, potentially voiding the trust. She had cornered me with bureaucracy. I pulled the door open, stepping aside to let him enter. Maya remained seated by the fire, her expression unreadable. Arthur stepped into the cottage, his eyes immediately darting around the room, mapping the layout. He did not look at the massive floor loom. He looked at the floorboards, the shelves, and the dining table where my canvas tote bag sat. Fascinating architecture, he murmured, taking a few steps toward the center of the room. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a high-resolution digital camera, not a standard appraisal tool like a magnifying loupe or a UV flashlight. He approached a small wooden chest resting near the loom. Draped over the lid was a delicate 17th century silk brocade panel that Beatrice had acquired from a Venetian estate sale decades ago. It was breathtakingly fragile, the metallic threads woven through the crimson silk susceptible to the oils on human skin. Arthur reached out with his bare hand, ready to flip the fabric over to search the chest underneath. "Do not touch that," I snapped. My voice cut through the quiet cottage like a cracking whip. Arthur paused, his hand hovering an inch above the crimson silk. He looked back at me, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. "I need to examine the warp and weft, Megan. It is standard procedure." My professional fury ignited, burning hotter than the hearth fire. I walked toward him, closing the distance until I was standing inches from his chest. "If you understand the warp and weft of 17th century Venetian silk, Arthur, then you know it utilizes a fragile silver gilt thread wound around a silk core," I said, my tone low and venomous. "You know that the oils from your bare hands will cause irreversible tarnishing to the metallic elements. You also know that evaluating a piece of this magnitude requires nitrile gloves, proper illumination, and a clean surface." Arthur's smirk faltered. He lowered his hand, taking a slight step backward. "You are not an appraiser," I continued, pressing the advantage. "You are a corporate spy, hired by my aunt to find a specific leather ledger. But you made a critical error, Arthur. You walked into my domain." I pointed a finger at his chest. The antiquities community in New York is incredibly small and fiercely protective. If I make one phone call tomorrow morning and describe how you attempted to handle a museum-quality brocade with bare hands in a freezing cabin, your reputation will be incinerated. You will never be hired by a reputable gallery or auction house again. You will be blacklisted. The color drained from Arthur's face. The slick, rehearsed confidence evaporated, replaced by genuine panic. He realized he was not dealing with a naive girl sitting in the woods. He was dealing with a professional who possessed the power to destroy his career. "Cynthia is paying me a retainer," Arthur stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "She said you were just holding on to some old family documents. She told me to photograph them so she could prepare her legal defense." "She lied to you," I told him, "and if you go back to her empty-handed, she will cut you loose and deny she ever hired you. But I can offer you a solution." Arthur swallowed hard, the camera trembling slightly in his grip. "What kind of solution?" I walked over to the dining table and retrieved a secondary manila folder from my tote bag. It contained the fabricated, heavily redacted financial documents I had prepared days ago in anticipation of an escalation. I had meticulously altered the spreadsheets to suggest Beatrice had lost the majority of her wealth in aggressive, failed investments shortly before her death. The documents painted a picture of an estate that was essentially bankrupt, holding nothing but the physical land. I slid the fabricated documents across the table. "You tell Cynthia you searched the cottage while I was distracted by the storm," I instructed. "You tell her you found this hidden under a floorboard. You photograph these pages and you deliver the images to her tonight." Arthur looked at the folder, then back at me, his mind racing. Why would I give her fake documents? "Because if you do exactly as I say, I will forget you ever stepped foot in this cottage," I promised. "You keep your retainer, you keep your reputation, and you walk away from the Hall family drama permanently. If you refuse, I will ruin you before sunrise." He did not hesitate. He picked up his camera, adjusting the lens. He photographed every page of the fabricated financial ruin, the flash illuminating the dark cottage in sharp bursts. When he finished, he tucked the camera back into his overcoat. I will tell her this is all I found, Arthur said, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogance. See yourself out, I told him. He walked out the door and hurried down the porch stairs. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, and the SUV backed out of the clearing, retreating down the mountain. Maya walked over to the table, staring at the empty space where the fabricated documents had been. That was a massive risk. She said, "What happens when Cynthia sees those photos?" I looked into the hearth, watching the birch logs crumble into ash. When Cynthia sees those photos, she will believe Beatrice died penniless. She will believe Granite Holdings is an empty shell. She will panic. And a panicked woman, Maya realized, her eyes widening, makes reckless decisions. Exactly, I said. Cynthia thinks she is out of time. She is going to abandon all caution and accelerate the illegal commercial developer sale to save herself from her own creditors. She is going to walk right into the trap. We just have to wait for the final day. The 30th day broke over the Vermont mountains with a blinding, crystalline clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the forest encased in ice that caught the morning sun like shattered glass. I stood by the stone hearth, watching the final embers of the birch fire burn down to ash. The air inside the saltbox cottage was frigid, but I no longer felt the bite. The residency clause was fulfilled. I had survived the physical blockade, the digital smear, the attempted burglary, and the corporate spy. The trap had closed. I retrieved the heavy leather ledger from the table, locking the brass padlock one final time. I tucked it into my canvas tote bag alongside the fabricated documents I had used to manipulate Arthur Vance. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped onto the porch. The world outside was perfectly still. I did not look back at the cottage. Its purpose was served. I began the descent down the mountain. The access road, previously choked with snow, was now packed hard by the recent vehicular traffic. The walk took less than 30 minutes. As I reached the lower tree line, the silence of the forest was replaced by the low, steady thrum of heavy machinery. Through the break in the pines, I saw the wrought iron gates of the main Stowe estate. A fleet of commercial vehicles idled in the driveway, massive yellow excavators, flatbed trucks carrying scaffolding, and sleek black sedans belonging to corporate executives. Cynthia had not wasted a single second. Believing the fabricated photos Arthur delivered, she assumed the estate was her only remaining asset and had rushed to finalize the $12 million sale to the eco-resort developers before her own creditors could seize her brand. I emerged from the tree line and walked onto the paved driveway. Cynthia stood near the hood of a pristine black Range Rover. She wore a tailored crimson wool coat, projecting an image of absolute control. Two men in expensive charcoal suits stood opposite her, holding a thick stack of legal closing documents. One of them handed her a gold-plated fountain pen. Ethan stood a few paces behind her, shifting his weight anxiously, his eyes darting toward the idling excavators. He needed this sale to clear his syndicate gambling debts today. I kept walking, my leather boots striking the pavement with deliberate, rhythmic steps. I veered slightly off the paved path, stepping onto the frozen grass bordering the driveway. My boot came down on a dry, frozen birch twig. The snap was as sharp as a gunshot in the crisp morning air. Cynthia froze, her hand, hovering just above the signature line of the final closing document, stopped mid-stroke. She turned her head slowly, her perfectly styled hair catching the winter sun. When she saw me, the color drained from her face, leaving her pale and hollowed out against the crimson coat. "Megan," she breathed, the words slipping out as a shocked exhale. "You are supposed to be on the mountain." "I am 30 days past the reading of the will, Cynthia," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the rumble of the diesel engines. "The residency clause is complete." Ethan took a step forward, his panic overriding his cowardice. "You cannot be here. We are finalizing a private commercial transaction. You have no standing." Before I could answer, the distinct sound of tires crunching on gravel drew our attention to the main gate. A silver sedan pulled up, followed immediately by a nondescript white van. Julian Pierce stepped out of the sedan, adjusting the lapels of his charcoal suit. Two men emerged from the white van, their faces impassive, wearing dark windbreakers. They were process servers. Julian walked directly toward the Range Rover, bypassing Ethan and stopping mere feet from the developers. "Gentlemen," Julian announced, his baritone voice cutting through the tension, "I am Julian Pierce, executor of the Beatrice Hall estate. I strongly advise you to put your pens down." The lead developer frowned, exchanging a confused glance with his partner. "We are executing a standard title transfer, Mr. Pierce. Cynthia Hall is the primary beneficiary. She holds the deed." Cynthia gripped the edge of the car hood, her knuckles turning white. "I have the probate documents. Mother left the estate to me. It is a matter of public record." Julian unclasped his leather briefcase. He did not retrieve the probate documents. He pulled out the pristine, watermarked archival paper I had seen at the diner. He unfolded it and placed it directly over Cynthia's closing contract on the hood of the Range Rover. "The primary will dictate the distribution of physical property," Julian explained, his tone clinical and unyielding. "However, Beatrice Hall established a blind trust, Granite Holdings, LLC, 20 years ago. The deed to this physical land, the structures upon it, and the very driveway we are standing on were transferred into that trust prior to her death." Cynthia stared at the document. Her eyes tracked the legal jargon, the realization dawning with terrifying speed. "The trust," she stammered. "Arthur told me the trust was empty. He showed me the financial records." "Arthur Vance is an incompetent spy who handled a 17th century silk brocade without gloves," I interjected, stepping closer to the vehicle. "He showed you fabricated documents I created specifically to induce this panic. You believe them because you are desperate." The developer stepped back from the vehicle, his expression morphing from confusion to outright fury. He pointed a finger at Cynthia. "You assured our legal team the title was clear. You signed a letter of intent claiming unencumbered ownership." Cynthia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Ethan for support, but my brother was staring at the process servers, his eyes wide with terror. "If you sign that contract," Julian told the developers, "you are engaging in a fraudulent transaction. Granite Holdings holds the master deed. Cynthia Hall possesses zero legal authority to sell a single blade of grass on this property." The lead developer snatched the closing documents out from under Julian's watermarked paper. He glared at Cynthia, his jaw set. "You just tried to commit federal wire fraud with our capital. Our legal department will be in touch regarding the due diligence fees you wasted." He turned on his heel and marched toward his black sedan. "Pack it up," he yelled to the foreman operating the nearest excavator. "We are leaving." The heavy machinery rumbled, the gears shifting in reverse. The convoy of trucks and sedans began to file out of the gates, a loud, chaotic retreat that left Cynthia standing alone by her Range Rover. She looked down at the gold pen still gripped in her hand, then let it drop. It clattered against the pavement and rolled under the tire. She collapsed against the side of the vehicle, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The luxury facade she had worn for a decade shattered, leaving a broken, terrified woman in a crimson coat. Ethan realized the magnitude of the disaster. The sale was dead. The cash injection he needed to pay the syndicates was gone. He turned toward me, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Megan, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You do not understand the leverage they have on me. They are going to take everything. You have to help me. We are family." He took another step toward me, but a figure stepped between us. It was Maya. She had driven up behind Julian's sedan and watched the entire confrontation unfold. She stood between me and Ethan, her posture rigid, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, unrelenting judgment. "You do not get to use that word anymore, Ethan," Maya said, her voice steady and precise. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She did not hand it to him. She pressed it flat against his chest, forcing him to take it. "These are the finalized separation papers," Maya told him. "My attorney filed them an hour ago. You can keep the offshore debt. You can keep the syndicate threats. I am keeping my self-respect." Ethan stared at the envelope, the final pillar of his life crumbling to dust. Maya turned away from him and walked over to stand beside me. The immediate threat was neutralized. The illegal sale was stopped. The physical estate was secure. Julian Pierce looked at me and offered a rare, genuine nod of approval. "The residency clause is satisfied, Megan. The trust is officially active." I walked past Cynthia, who was still leaning against her vehicle, staring blankly at the snow. I walked past Ethan, who was clutching his divorce papers like a lifeline. I walked up the wide stone steps leading to the grand entrance of the main house. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the front door, and turned the lock. The mechanism clicked open. I pushed the door wide and stepped inside, crossing the threshold not as the marginalized niece, but as the rightful owner of the Hall family empire. I crossed the threshold of the main estate, leaving the bitter Vermont morning behind. The grand foyer smelled of lemon oil and old wood, exactly as it had during my childhood. The silence here felt different than the silence on the mountain. It was not the quiet of isolation. It was the quiet of a vacant throne room. Julian Pierce followed closely behind, his leather briefcase in hand, the sharp clicks of his dress shoes echoing against the polished marble floor. We walked past the sweeping staircase and entered the library. Beatrice had spent her final years in this room. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves housed thousands of rare volumes. A massive Persian rug anchored the space, and in the center sat a sprawling antique partner's desk. Julian set his briefcase on the desk and unclasped it. "The time for defensive maneuvering is over," he stated, pulling out the thick stack of watermarked documents. I stood near the tall windows overlooking the driveway. Outside, Cynthia was still leaning against her vehicle, and Ethan was staring blankly at his divorce papers. They looked small against the vast expanse of the property they had tried to steal. "You have satisfied the residency clause." Julian continued, laying the papers flat. "It is time to legally activate Granite Holdings." I approached the desk. The documents were dense with legal phrasing, detailing the immediate transfer of executive authority. Julian handed me a small, velvet-lined box. Inside rested a vintage 1940s fountain pen. It was a Parker Vacuumatic, its celluloid barrel gleaming with a pearlescent stripe. Beatrice had used this exact pen to sign her most critical contracts. I unscrewed the cap. The gold nib caught the morning light filtering through the window panes. I pressed the tip to the heavy parchment. The black ink flowed perfectly, tracking my signature across the final line of the activation agreement. With that single stroke, the dynamic shifted permanently. I was no longer an outcast niece fighting for a drafty cottage. I was the chief executive officer and sole trustee of a multi-million-dollar blind trust. I held the reins of a financial empire. "We need to conduct an immediate, comprehensive audit," I instructed, my voice steady. "Bring me the UCC-1 filings and the corresponding asset schedules." Julian pulled a secondary folder from his briefcase. He handed me a stack of detailed financial ledgers. I set up my base of operations right there at the mahogany partner's desk. I was an appraiser. I was trained to scrutinize microscopic details to determine the true value of an object. I applied that exact methodology to my family's financial history. For the next several hours, I cross-referenced the moral debt ledger from the cottage with the legal documents Julian provided. The picture that emerged was a masterpiece of financial leverage. Beatrice had not acted out of blind generosity. She had engineered a sophisticated system of control. Every dollar she provided to Cynthia, Ethan, and Chloe was secured by airtight pledge agreements. She owned the majority equity in Cynthia's luxury brand. She held the primary liens on Ethan's commercial real estate properties. She possessed the voting rights to Chloe's media holding company. I looked at the flawless black ink of my signature beside Beatrice's red annotations. The true genius of my grandmother's plan crystallized in my mind. She did not leave me this trust as a simple financial windfall to secure my future. If she wanted to do that, she could have simply left me cash in the primary will. She left me Granite Holdings because she knew the money itself was a poison. It had corrupted her children and grandchildren, turning them into entitled parasites. She did not leave me wealth. She left me the legal authority to discipline a profoundly broken family. I hold the voting rights to Cynthia's company, I noted, tracing a line on the spreadsheet. Julian nodded. You control the board. You can freeze her operational accounts immediately. And Ethan's properties, I asked, turning the page. The liens give you priority over his unsecured creditors, Julian confirmed. You can force the liquidation of his assets before the syndicates ever see a dime. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. The power was absolute. I could dismantle their lives with a few phone calls. I could leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Prepare the notices, I ordered. Julian opened a portable printer he had brought in his sedan. He connected it to his encrypted laptop. The machine hummed to life. Over the next hour, it produced a steady stream of formal corporate documents. These were not polite requests for repayment. They were aggressive, uncompromising notices of default and asset seizure. Julian pulled the final page from the printer. He collated the stack and placed it on the desk before me. He reached into his briefcase one last time and produced a heavy brass stamp and a stick of red sealing wax. He melted the wax over the corner of the top document. He pressed the stamp into the cooling resin. When he pulled it away, the Granite Holdings crest remained, a stark, formal seal of authority. The notices are ready for execution, Julian said softly. I placed my hand flat against the stack of papers. The wax was still warm beneath my palm. The gravity of the moment settled over me. These documents were the nuclear launch codes I had been hiding in the cottage. They contained the power to utterly ruin my blood relatives. My cell phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID displayed Chloe's name. She had remained silent in Boston while Cynthia and Ethan orchestrated the failed eviction. Now the ripples of the blocked sale had reached her. I picked up the device. Megan, Chloe's voice sounded frantic, the polished influencer persona completely stripped away. Cynthia just called me in hysterics. She said you stopped the sale. She said Julian pulled a blind trust out of his briefcase. What is going on? I looked at the stack of seizure notices. Chloe, I said, my voice cool and detached, check your mail tomorrow morning. I hung up before she could respond. The defensive war was officially over. I picked up the stack of sealed documents ready to launch the offensive. I walked toward the library doors, the heavy parchment secure in my grip. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the quiet girl sitting in the dark. Julian Pierce operated with a lethal efficiency honed over 3 decades of corporate warfare. He did not dispatch the notices of default through standard mail or email. He utilized a network of specialized process servers, ensuring that the delivery was not only legally binding, but publicly undeniable. The offensive began on a Tuesday morning. I sat at the mahogany partner's desk in the library, authenticating a 17th century Flemish tapestry for a client in London, while the traps snapped shut across 3 different states. Cynthia received her notice at the flagship retail location of her luxury brand in Manhattan. The process server arrived during a high-profile meeting with potential investors. He bypassed the receptionist, walked directly into the glass-walled conference room, and placed the heavy, red wax-sealed folder onto the table in front of her. The terms inside were brutally clear. Under the Uniform Commercial Code pledge agreements, she had 14 days to repay a sum exceeding $4 million. If she failed, Granite Holdings would exercise its right to execute a hostile board takeover, seizing control of her inventory, her trademarks, and her operational accounts. Ethan was served at a charity golf tournament in Connecticut. He was standing on the 18th green, attempting to charm a group of regional bankers into extending a line of credit. The server handed him the notice in full view of his peers. The document detailed the immediate execution of priority liens against his commercial properties, freezing his ability to secure secondary financing or liquidate assets without my explicit authorization. Chloe was the only one who received her notice at home. The server bypassed the concierge of her Boston condominium building and knocked on her penthouse door. The notice demanded immediate repayment of the emergency funds Beatrice had wired her over the past 5 years, secured by the equity in the condominium itself. By Wednesday afternoon, the return receipts began to arrive at the Stowe estate. The satisfying slap of the certified mail green cards hitting the mahogany desk was a tangible confirmation of victory. They had been served. The 14-day clock was ticking. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. They did not coordinate a defense. Panic destroys alliances, and each of them scrambled to save themselves. Chloe was the first to retaliate. She possessed a digital empire and a massive following, and she decided to weaponize her audience. She initiated a live stream broadcast from her penthouse. She did not wear makeup. She wore a simple gray hoodie, carefully crafting the image of a devastated victim. She spent 20 minutes crying to the camera, claiming that a jealous, vindictive relative had manipulated their dying grandmother into signing away the family fortune. She spun a narrative of emotional abuse and financial extortion, begging her followers for support and promising to fight the injustice in court. She underestimated the team sitting in the Stowe library. Maya had formally joined my operation that morning. After serving Ethan with separation papers, she redirected her brilliant, analytical mind away from architectural load-bearing structures and focused entirely on public relations and digital strategy for Granite Holdings. She watched Chloe's live stream on a tablet, her expression cold and calculating. "It is time to dismantle the influencer," Maya stated, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her laptop. Maya did not engage in a public argument. She utilized precision digital warfare. She compiled the IP tracking logs provided by her cybersecurity contact, proving definitively that the smear campaign against my appraisal business originated from Chloe's residential network. She paired that data with the scanned copies of the non-disclosure agreements I had found hidden in the Trapunto quilt, highlighting the staggering payouts Beatrice made to silence the independent jewelry designers Chloe had plagiarized. Maya packaged the evidence into a clean, unassailable digital dossier and sent it directly to the legal departments of Chloe's top 3 corporate sponsors, copying several prominent fashion industry journalists. The fallout was instantaneous. Within 4 hours, Chloe's primary cosmetics sponsor issued a public statement terminating their relationship, citing a zero-tolerance policy for intellectual property theft. The fashion blogs picked up the story immediately, publishing the NDA details. The narrative shifted from a victimized granddaughter to exposed fraud. Her follower count hemorrhaged, the live stream was deleted, and her social media accounts went dark. Chloe's career evaporated before the sun set. Ethan's collapse was less public, but equally devastating. His business model relied entirely on the perception of solvency. When the regional bankers witnessed him being served on the golf course, rumors of his financial instability spread rapidly through the commercial real estate community. His development partners demanded explanations. When they conducted an emergency audit of his capital structures, they discovered the UCC-1 filings. They realized his initial investments were not personal wealth, but heavily leveraged debt, controlled by a blind trust he did not manage. The partners invoked the morality and insolvency clauses in their operating agreements. They voted to expel him from the development group, severing his access to the remaining project funds. Ethan was left holding a portfolio of unfinished buildings with zero capital. while the illegal gambling syndicates continued to demand payment. He was completely boxed in. Cynthia was the only one who attempted a legal counteroffensive. She retained a ferocious litigator in Manhattan, demanding an emergency injunction to halt the 14-day clock. She argued that the pledge agreements were signed under duress and that Granite Holdings was a fraudulent entity. Julian Pierce anticipated the move. He responded to the filing by submitting the 3 preemptive cognitive capacity evaluations Beatrice had secured prior to establishing the trust. The neurological reports were airtight, certified by top-tier specialists, confirming Beatrice possessed exceptional mental acuity. The federal judge reviewed the documents, dismissed Cynthia's petition with prejudice, and ordered her to pay the associated court costs. The 14 days bled away. The silence from my family was profound. There were no more threats of condemnation, no more digital smear campaigns, no more corporate spies. They had exhausted their arsenals and shattered against the unyielding wall of corporate law. On the evening of the 14th day, a heavy, freezing rain battered the Stowe estate. I sat in the library reviewing the finalized transfer documents that would officially vest their assets into Granite Holdings at midnight. The antique wall clock chimed 11 times. The deadline was less than an hour away. A sharp, persistent buzzing sound interrupted the quiet. I looked up from the desk. The intercom system connected to the main security gate at the base of the driveway was flashing a red indicator light. Julian, who was seated by the fireplace reviewing a contract, set his pen down. Maya paused her typing. I walked over to the intercom panel and pressed the audio button. Megan. The voice was thin, ragged, and stripped of all its former arrogance. It barely carried over the sound of the freezing rain hitting the intercom microphone. Please open the gate. I looked at the security monitor. The camera feed displayed the wrought iron gates illuminated by the harsh glare of security floodlights. Standing in the freezing downpour, soaked to the bone and shivering, were Cynthia and Ethan. They had not arrived in a luxury SUV or a European sedan. They had arrived in a local taxi, which was currently turning around to leave them stranded at the entrance. They carried no luggage. They carried no legal folders. They had come to surrender. I released the intercom button, the silence returning to the library. The final conflict had arrived at my doorstep, and it was time to dictate the terms of their ruin. The buzzer on the intercom fell silent after I pressed the gate release button. The heavy iron gates at the base of the driveway groaned open, their hinges protesting against the cold. From the tall library window, I watched 2 figures trudge up the long paved incline. The freezing rain lashed at them in sheets. They carried no umbrellas to shield themselves. They leaned forward into the bitter wind, their heads bowed against the storm. It took them 10 agonizing minutes to traverse the distance from the road to the front steps. I remained seated behind the antique mahogany partner's desk. Julian stood near the roaring fireplace, holding a leather folio, his expression neutral. Maya sat in a wingback chair in the corner, her posture relaxed but vigilant. We did not walk to the grand foyer to greet them. We let them navigate the echoing entrance hall alone. The heavy oak doors of the library pushed inward. Cynthia and Ethan stepped onto the threshold. They dripped icy water onto the polished hardwood floor. 30 days ago, they had occupied this exact room with an air of invincible entitlement. Cynthia had worn pristine synthetic cashmere. Ethan had worn tailored imported wool. Today, their garments clung to them, darkened and ruined by the torrential storm. Cynthia carried a structured handbag. She shifted her weight, shivering uncontrollably from the biting chill. The strap of the handbag slipped off her wet shoulder. The bag hit the floor just off the edge of the Persian rug. The sound was a hollow, plastic thud. It was not the muted, heavy impact of authentic full-grain leather. It was a counterfeit replica. The cheap noise echoed in the quiet library. It was the perfect, pathetic summation of her entire existence. A cheap replica trying to pass as luxury, finally hitting rock bottom. Ethan spoke first. He wiped rainwater from his eyes with the back of his trembling hand. His voice shook, stripped entirely of its usual smooth cadence. He said my name. He told me the syndicates were actively looking for him. He said his real estate partners had locked him out of the commercial accounts and severed his access to the project funds. He pleaded with me to release the liens just long enough for him to secure a high-interest bridge loan. He told me we were siblings. He used the word family as if it were a magic spell capable of erasing the past month of warfare. He said family has to protect family. I sat perfectly still. I listened to the rain lashing against the window panes. I thought about the heavy steel pry bar he had jammed under the window of the saltbox cottage while I was outside chopping wood. I let his desperate plea hang in the damp air until the silence became unbearable. He flinched under my steady gaze. Cynthia stepped forward. She attempted to summon her old, commanding presence, but her teeth were chattering loudly. She claimed Beatrice never intended for the trust to be used this way. She insisted her mother loved them and wanted them to succeed. She told me I had made my point, that I had proven I was smart and capable, but executing the corporate seizures was purely vindictive. She asked me to forgive the commercial loans. She promised to invite me to her home for Thanksgiving every year. She offered me a seat at her holiday table in exchange for her corporate empire. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I reached across the polished mahogany and pulled the heavy leather ledger toward me. The brass padlock was already unclasped. I opened the thick parchment cover. The sharp medicinal scent of peppermint oil rose into the damp air of the library, cutting through the smell of wet wool. Cynthia and Ethan stared at the book. They did not know what it was. They only knew it held the architecture of their ruin. I turned the pages until I found Cynthia's section. I scanned the flawless black ink detailing her staggering financial debts. Then I focused on the striking red ink in the margins. I looked up at my aunt. I told her I was not looking at her financial ledger. I told her I was looking at her moral deficit. I read the red ink aloud. I detailed the specific afternoon Beatrice wired her the capital to save her third quarter retail margins. I read the exact words Beatrice wrote when she asked her own daughter to stay for a cup of tea. I read how Cynthia claimed her driver was waiting outside. I looked Cynthia in the eye and told her the tea went cold. "You do not owe $200,000, Cynthia," I said, keeping my tone level and unyielding. "You owe 52 missed Sunday dinners and 100 abandoned cups of tea, and Granite Holdings is collecting." Cynthia stared at me. Her mouth opened, but the rehearsed excuses died in her throat. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. I turned the page to Ethan's section. I found a note from 3 years ago. I read how Beatrice paid off his first syndicate debt so the bookmakers would not break his legs. I read the red ink detailing how Ethan spent the very next weekend purchasing a European sports car instead of visiting Beatrice when she was admitted to the local hospital for pneumonia. "You do not owe a real estate lien, Ethan," I told him. "You owe her the hospital visits you skipped because you were too busy pretending to be wealthy." Ethan looked down at his ruined shoes. He had no defense. He had nothing left to leverage. I closed the ledger. The heavy leather cover landed with a definitive thud. I told them, family is not a shield you get to raise only when the consequences of your actions finally catch up to you. I pointed to Maya sitting quietly in the corner. I told them family is the seasoned firewood Maya carried through a blizzard while Ethan tried to break into the cottage. I told them they spent their entire lives treating Beatrice like an automatic teller machine, and they spent the last 30 days treating me like a peasant. Cynthia broke. It was not the calculated, performative crying she used at the will reading to gather sympathy from Julian. It was a raw, jagged sob. Her shoulders heaved. The tears mixed with the freezing rain on her cheeks. She dropped to her knees on the edge of the Persian rug. She realized the manipulation tactics she had spent a lifetime perfecting were entirely useless. There was no charm left to deploy. There was no guilt trip that would work. She was staring at an unshakable boundary. She begged me not to take her brand. She said it was all she had left in the world. I looked down at her kneeling on the floor. I did not feel pity. I felt the quiet resolution of a properly authenticated truth. I told her Granite Holdings was not forgiving a single cent of the debt. I informed them the 14-day clock had expired. The board takeover was active. The liens were executed. I told them they would pay back everything they took. Ethan let out a hollow sound, a man realizing he had reached the end of the road. I let them sit with the reality of their destruction for a long moment. Then I reached for a new stack of documents, resting on the corner of the desk. I told them I was not going to leave them on the street to be hunted by syndicates or thrown into federal court. I told them I had drafted a restructuring plan. I told them they were going to work off their debts and they were going to start tomorrow morning. The morning sun pierced the heavy Vermont cloud cover, casting sharp beams of light across the polished library floor. Julian Pierce arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, carrying a fresh leather briefcase filled with finalized restructuring contracts. The time for begging had passed. The storm outside had broken, leaving the estate encased in a quiet, unforgiving frost. Now came the precise arithmetic of accountability. Cynthia and Ethan sat across the mahogany partner's desk. They had exchanged their ruined, rain-soaked garments for borrowed wool sweaters from the guest wing. In the harsh daylight, stripped of their designer labels and arrogant postures, they looked small and incredibly fragile. I did not offer them coffee. I slid the first legal document toward my older brother. Ethan possessed a genuine talent for recognizing prime commercial real estate, a skill he had squandered on flashy, hollow development deals meant to impress his superficial social circle. I did not intend to strip him of his ability to work. I stripped him of his unearned status. Granite Holdings officially assumed the title to his remaining properties. Julian orchestrated the immediate sale of his imported sports cars, funneling the proceeds directly to the illicit gambling syndicates to satisfy the most dangerous liabilities. The remaining deficit was consolidated under the trust. Maya stepped forward from the corner of the room to present the final divorce decree. Ethan picked up a standard ballpoint pen. He did not argue. He signed his name on the dotted line, severing his marriage with a shaking hand. He walked away with no alimony, no shared assets, and no dignity. To repay his debt to the trust, I secured him a position on a local residential framing crew in the valley. He was no longer a hotshot developer issuing demands from a climate-controlled glass office. He became a junior contractor, required to wear a hard hat, pour concrete foundation, and frame timber walls in the biting northern cold. A large portion of his weekly paycheck was automatically garnished by Julian to settle his arrears. He traded his European tailoring for thick denim and steel-toed work boots. He would learn the true value of a dollar by building homes with his bare hands. Cynthia presented a far more complex challenge. Her entire identity relied upon the illusion of self-made excellence. I authorized the hostile board takeover of Cynthia Hall Luxury Imports before the clock struck noon. The ensuing corporate audit revealed exactly what my trained appraiser eye had suspected all along. She sourced her materials from exploitative, low-wage manufacturing plants overseas, deliberately rebranding synthetic polyester blends as ethically sourced organic textiles. I instructed Maya to release the comprehensive audit findings to the fashion industry press. The resulting scandal shuttered her retail storefronts and voided her pending global distribution contracts within hours. The fake empire crumbled into dust, leaving only her staggering financial obligations to Granite Holdings. I offered my aunt a single, non-negotiable path forward. She would repay her deficit through manual labor. I ordered the remote saltbox cottage outfitted with a modest wood stove and basic survival supplies. I assigned Cynthia to Beatrice's antique floor loom. For years, She had mocked my profession, calling the preservation of history a quaint little hobby. Now she would experience the grueling physical reality of authentic craftsmanship. Her task was to handspin and weave historically accurate textiles using raw sheep wool and traditional mordant dyes. I set an hourly wage based on standard market rates for apprentice weavers, deducting 80% of her earnings to service the trust. I drove her up the mountain road in my rattling Subaru. The snowbanks were still high, framing the treacherous, icy path. Cynthia stared out the passenger window, her face pale, stripped of expensive cosmetics and false confidence. We arrived at the isolated wooden structure. I unlocked the heavy oak door and led her inside. The loom stood in the center of the room, imposing and rigid. I provided her with a thick binder containing historical colonial weaving patterns and a large supply of raw materials. I explained the strict daily production quotas required to maintain her employment and avoid default. She ran her manicured hands over the polished oak frame of the loom. The reality of her new existence settled over her like a heavy winter blanket. She would spend her days in the quiet isolation she had originally designed for me, learning the profound value of authentic, painstaking work. I left her standing by the hearth and drove back down the mountain. Returning to the main house, I walked into the grand library. The heavy leather ledger rested on the center of the desk. I ran my fingers over the cracked, weather-beaten binding. The faint, sharp scent of peppermint oil rose from the parchment, triggering a vivid memory of Beatrice sitting in this very room. My grandmother had wielded this book as a silent, patient witness to decades of greed. I had used it as a sword to cut the infection out of our bloodline. Its purpose was now fulfilled. I carried the thick volume to the far corner of the library, where a heavy iron floor safe sat bolted securely to the stone foundation. I turned the combination dial, pulled the thick steel door open, and placed the ledger inside. I engaged the internal locking mechanism. I pulled the tarnished brass key from my pocket, inserting it into the secondary lock, and turned it with a definitive, satisfying click. I slid the key into my top desk drawer. The era of hidden debts and unspoken resentment was permanently sealed away. Maya stood by the tall windows overlooking the driveway, unrolling a large set of architectural blueprints across a drafting table. We had neutralized the parasites, but we needed to build something enduring and authentic in their place. Granite Holdings required a legitimate operational focus beyond debt collection. We decided to transform the Stowe property into a premier historical restoration foundation. Maya utilized her brilliant structural expertise to design state-of-the-art, climate-controlled archival facilities within the unused guest wings of the manor. I leveraged my industry contacts to secure lucrative contracts with national museums and elite private collectors, offering authentication, preservation, and repair services for rare global antiquities. We built a thriving, legitimate enterprise founded on precision, transparency, and undeniable work ethic. We hired local experts, researchers, and textile conservationists. The grand halls of the estate, once filled with the toxic echoes of entitlement and performative wealth, now hummed with the quiet, purposeful energy of genuine creation. The warfare was over. We had sterilized the wounds, restructured the legacy, and paved the way for a future built on solid ground. The only thing left to do was look out over the empire we had secured and set the final rules for anyone who wished to enter it. 1 year passed. The Vermont mountain breathed differently now. The suffocating tension that once blanketed the Stowe estate dissolved, replaced by the rhythmic, purposeful hum of genuine labor. We transformed the sprawling property into the Beatrice Hall Center for Textile Preservation. The grand entrance hall no longer echoed with hollow boasts or the clatter of counterfeit designer heels. Instead, the air carried the scent of archival tissue paper, natural sizing starch, and cedar. Maya stood in the center of the newly renovated East Wing, a rolled architectural schematic tucked under her arm. She directed a team of specialized contractors installing a state-of-the-art humidity control system. She integrated sleek, modern glass enclosures seamlessly into the original 18th century timber framework. She did not just survive her divorce, she rebuilt her foundation from bedrock upward. Without the dead weight of an enabling husband, her career skyrocketed. She was a full equity partner in the foundation, commanding the room with a quiet, unshakable authority. Under our joint leadership, Granite Holdings secured lucrative preservation contracts. In the main laboratory, our hired conservationists worked on a set of fragile Civil War-era hospital linens and a woven tapestry from a 19th century abolitionist meeting house. We built a thriving enterprise founded on precision, transparency, and undeniable work ethic. Down in the valley, Ethan was finishing his first full year on the residential framing crew. Maya received a photo from a mutual acquaintance a few weeks prior. Ethan wore a faded canvas jacket, holding a pneumatic nail gun, his face weathered by the relentless northern sun and biting wind. He paid his monthly garnishments to the trust without a single late notice. The syndicate debts were settled. He lived in a modest studio apartment near the lumberyard. He was poor, exhausted, and for the first time in his adult life, entirely honest. I left the main house during the late afternoon. The access road, once a frozen battlefield blocked by a luxury vehicle, was now a well-maintained gravel path winding through the changing maple trees. The autumn air carried a sharp, familiar chill. I walked up the incline, my leather boots crunching against the fallen amber leaves. I carried a steel thermos of hot water and a small canvas bag. I crested the final hill and approached the saltbox cottage. I did not walk up the porch stairs immediately. I stopped near the tree line and looked through the narrow, recessed window. The interior of the cottage was warm, illuminated by the steady glow of the wood stove. In the center of the room, the heavy, antique oak loom dominated the space. Cynthia sat on the wooden bench. She pushed the heavy wooden shuttle through the tensioned warp threads, her arm extending in a fluid, repetitive motion. She pulled the beater bar back with a firm, rhythmic thwack, locking the woolen weft into place. Her hands, previously pristine and manicured, were rough. Her fingertips bore the dark, stubborn stains of natural indigo and madder root dyes. She wore a simple, unadorned wool sweater. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot. She stopped weaving for a moment, noticing a frayed warp thread. A year ago, she would have yelled at a subordinate to fix the imperfection. Today, she leaned forward, squinting in the lantern light, and painstakingly rethreaded the heddle herself. She looked visibly exhausted. The lines around her eyes deepened by months of grueling physical exertion. Yet, as she examined the tight, flawless weave of the fabric she was creating, a subtle shift occurred in her posture. She was no longer performing for an audience. She was producing a tangible, authentic artifact. She was earning her living, yard by yard, paying down her moral and financial deficit through the exact craft she once dismissed as a quaint hobby. I stepped onto the wooden porch. I did not knock. I sat down in the heavy Adirondack chair facing the tree line. I opened my canvas bag and retrieved a chipped ceramic mug. It bore the faded image of a cardinal, the paint worn thin from decades of use. It was Beatrice's favorite cup. I poured the hot water from the thermos over a bundle of dried mint leaves. The steam rose into the crisp mountain air, carrying the sharp medicinal scent of peppermint oil. It mingled with the deep, earthy aroma of the surrounding pine forest. I held the warm ceramic between my palms. The mountain was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence. The war was over. Sitting on this porch, breathing in the peppermint and pine, the true architecture of Beatrice's plan became undeniably clear. True inheritance is rarely found in a leather folio presented across a polished mahogany conference table. It is not the liquid cash in an offshore account or the deed to a commercial property. Those things are merely tools, and in the wrong hands, they are toxins. Beatrice knew wealth without discipline breeds parasites. My grandmother left me a frozen cabin, a severed power line, and a ring of enemies. She forced me into a crucible because she understood that true power is the quiet resilience built when nobody is watching. She gave me the authority to draw a line in the sand and the leverage to punish anyone who crossed it. I did not win because I possessed a magic key. I won because I knew how to sit in the dark, read the fine print, and endure the winter. I'm talking to you now. Whether you are listening to this on a crowded morning commute, sitting alone in a quiet room, or driving down a long stretch of highway. If you have ever sat at a table while people who share your blood handed you an empty envelope, if you have ever been mocked for your quiet choices by people performing loud, hollow lives, hear this. Sometimes the key to the kingdom is disguised as a lump of coal. Sometimes the greatest gift you will ever receive is being underestimated by arrogant people. When you finally stand up and claim your space, you must protect it with ironclad borders. I wrote 3 rules for myself during those 30 days in the dark, and I live by them today. 1. Blood dictates biology. It does not dictate access. You do not owe a seat at your table to anyone who brings disrespect to your door. 2. Forgiveness is a personal journey, but reconciliation requires changed behavior. You can let go of the anger without ever letting them back into your life. 3. Your worth is never determined by the people who cannot afford your price. I took a slow sip from the chipped mug. The peppermint tea burned away the lingering autumn chill. Below me, the estate hummed with the energy of a legacy preserved and protected. Behind me, the steady thwack of the loom continued, marking the slow, honest passage of time. The locked ledger rested securely in the iron safe, its purpose served. The debt was being paid. The borders were secure. I leaned back in the wooden chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the wind move through the Vermont pines. Everything was exactly where it belonged. We sit around our dining room tables in America, passing platters of roasted turkey and green beans, smiling for holiday photos that will soon fade on a mantelpiece. In the relentless pursuit of the American dream, we often build these traditional family structures with the best of intentions, convinced that providing a sprawling roof, an elite education, and a comfortable bank account means we have successfully fulfilled our parental duties. We work grueling hours to ensure our children have more than we did. But beneath the polished, picture-perfect veneer of these gatherings, there is often a quiet, invisible accounting taking place. It is a ledger kept not in dollars, cents, or stock portfolios, but in slights, comparisons, and the profound, echoing silence of emotional neglect. Through emotionally charged family dramas, Cherry Vengeance not only tells the story of the hurt caused by parental favoritism, but also aims to convey a profound lesson to parents in America and families worldwide. Love should not be based on comparison or discrimination. We live in a society that relentlessly measures a child's worth by their external, highly visible achievements. A child who is neglected today may carry that wound for a lifetime. It is a subtle, insidious kind of trauma that shapes their entire worldview. A child who is praised solely for their perceived wealth or status learns that love is entirely conditional, breeding an arrogant, hollow entitlement. Conversely, the child who is neglected or scorned for choosing a quieter, more authentic path internalizes a deep sense of unworthiness. The channel hopes to remind parents to listen, be fair, and be responsible for each child's feelings. At the same time, society needs to seriously address the emotional wounds within families instead of viewing them as normal. We must stop normalizing the pain of the unfavored child. Because sometimes what a child needs most isn't money, but the feeling that they are loved just as much as everyone else. This brings us to the absolute core of what we are actually teaching our children. Through the story, the lesson is, family education needs to emphasize that true wealth lies not in the numbers in a bank account, but in skills and integrity. When we insulate our children from the harsh realities of hard work, when we bail them out of every consequence with a wire transfer or an angry phone call to a teacher, we strip them of their resilience. We rob them of the quiet dignity that comes from building something with their own two hands. A parent's greatest, most profound responsibility is not to hand their child a pre-built empire, but to teach them how to lay a strong, unshakable foundation. It is about instilling an understanding of the value of honest labor. Money without discipline, without the calloused hands of actual effort, is a corrosive force. It rusts the moral compass of the next generation and leaves them defenseless when the real world inevitably arrives at their door. But perhaps the most tragic failure of modern parenting occurs when we use that money as a substitute for ourselves. A reminder for parents. Parents need to understand that every time they ignore their children's feelings or use money to replace their presence, it is recorded in the child's soul as a debt. This is the true, inescapable moral debt. It is the school play missed because of a late boardroom meeting, awkwardly compensated for with the newest piece of technology. It is the quiet, desperate cry for help, met with a check rather than a meaningful eye-to-eye conversation. It is the tragic reality of asking a child to stay for a cup of tea, only to watch them walk away because their manufactured life is too busy. Action. Don't let the teacups get cold because of preoccupation with vanity. That cold porcelain represents a missed opportunity for connection that can never be bought back. Listening and emotional fairness are what truly make a child feel loved. How then do we navigate the wreckage when these traditional structures fail us? We must redefine the very concept of kinship. The story redefines the concept of family, not just based on blood ties, but on presence and loyalty. We are culturally conditioned to believe that blood is an unbreakable bond, a mandatory obligation that supersedes all personal well-being. But Megan's 3 rules of life are important guiding lessons for anyone trying to heal from generational dysfunction. First, blood ties are biological, not access rights. No one has the right to hurt you just because they are blood relatives. Sharing a genetic code does not grant someone a free pass to disrespect your boundaries or diminish your spirit. Second, reconciliation requires behavioral change. Forgiveness may be personal, but getting back together requires genuine change. You can absolutely forgive a parent or a sibling for your own peace of mind, to release the poison from your own heart, but you do not have to invite them back to your dinner table unless they have done the hard, uncomfortable work of accountability. Third, self-worth. Don't let people who don't understand your worth dictate your life. You are the sole author of your value. These principles are not just rules for survival, they are the vital blueprints for building a healthier, more emotionally aware generation. If we want to raise children who are whole, we must start by fiercely examining our own ledgers. We must ask ourselves what behaviors we are truly valuing, what actions we are rewarding, and whose pain we are ignoring in the name of keeping the peace. Finally, if this video touches your heart, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to leave a comment over a cherry vengeance. We are dedicated to sharing the stories that challenge the facades we build and celebrating the quiet, hard-won victories of personal integrity and emotional truth. As you sit at your own dining table tonight, looking at the faces of the people you call family, take a moment to look past the performance. Listen to the heavy silence between the spoken words. Are the teacups growing cold? And if you were handed a weathered ledger detailing every single emotional transaction of your life, would you have the courage to read the red ink in the margins?